Hello, tiny people. Welcome to today's lesson. This is the Emancipation Proclamation, which is a very important document in American history. I'm going to have to do a little bubble popping today. Sometimes people are raised with an idea about others that well, might not be entirely true. As we look through the lens of history and glance back at time, sometimes we see people perhaps a little bit better than they were, a little different than they were. For example, we're going to talk a little bit here about Abraham Lincoln. When Abraham Lincoln was alive, he was not a popular president. Remember, in his first election, he only won 40% of the popular vote. That means 6 out of every 10 people that voted against Abraham Lincoln. After his assassination, though, suddenly he rose up to be this mythical figure. But there is more of humanity to Lincoln than we know. This is an actual quote from Abraham Lincoln when he was nearing his first election. He said, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it." It wasn't that he loved slavery, it wasn't that he hated black people. No, he was a product of his time. And what he was looking at was the possibility of the United States breaking apart. So his reason for the beginning of the Civil War, for taking up the challenge the Confederates had thrown at Fort Sumter, and his willingness to raise armies and send them into the South into battle, was number one, to preserve the Union. The Union being the country altogether, to preserve the Union, to keep the United States from breaking apart. There would come another reason. Actually, there'd be two more, but right now we're talking about the second one, to emancipate the slaves. And to emancipate means to give them freedom. Now, there were two reasons why Lincoln made this declaration, this Emancipation Proclamation, why he said to the world that the slaves would be free. And the first reason was the morality of slavery. Lincoln had never liked the idea. He was willing to put up with it if that would keep the country together, but the country had broken. And now he was moving in the direction of ending this horrible national plight of slavery, which was the core reason for the American Civil War. But make no mistake about it, Abraham Lincoln was a wartime president. The Emancipation Proclamation was an act of war. It was every bit as big a weapon as that cannon that you see pictured on the right. The first thing Lincoln needed after all of the losses and setbacks that had been suffered in the first part of the war was he needed something of a victory. He got enough of a victory at Antietam. Remember the Battle of Sharpsburg, Antietam? Robert E. Lee's first invasion, where the battle plans had been lost by one of the Confederate officers. They had picked up by McClellan's staff. And McClellan knew where Lee was going and how his army was divided. And yet McClellan ineptly did not defeat each section of the army individually. He waited for Lee to reunite his army at Sharpsburg, Maryland, near Antietam Creek. Well, it had been enough of a victory. Lee had been turned back into Virginia. He hadn't been successful in his first foray into the North. So on September 22nd, 1862, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. He just declared this like an executive order we hear talked about so much today. He issued it on September 22nd, but it was not to take effect until January 1st of 1863. What the Emancipation Proclamation said was that all slaves still held in slavery in areas in rebellion, that's huge, areas still in rebellion on January 1st, 1863, would be free. So he freed the slaves only in the areas he did not control. The North had taken New Orleans. There were lots of slaves in and around New Orleans and southern Louisiana. There were slaves in western Tennessee. There were slaves in parts of Kentucky. There were slaves up in Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, in portions and places that the North controlled. Lincoln did not free them. He said, I am freeing all of the slaves in areas still held or still in rebellion against the United States. Now, he did this for 4 reasons. Oh man, does this sound like a chance to take some notes? Oh, I'm so jealous. The first reason was to show the radical members of his party, he was a Republican, to show the radical members of his party that Lincoln was taking the lead on the slavery issue. The abolitionists had been raising more and more of a storm because the North hadn't declared that it was fighting to free the slaves, hadn't declared that at the end of the war they would make sure the slavery was gone. So Lincoln said, I want to show them that I am in charge. I'm out in front on this issue. The second reason Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation was to tell the Confederate states that if they were still rebelling as of January 1st of 1863, that their slaves would be freed. They would lose their slaves and they would not be compensated. They would be paid no money for that. The third reason for Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was that he wanted to make Britain and France realize that if they came in on the side of the Confederacy, then they would be declaring to the world that their country was on the side of slavery. Each of those countries had gotten rid of slavery in the decades before our American Civil War. Britain was the later to do it, and it had been quite an argument, and it had gone on for years and years. There weren't really a lot of slaves in Britain or France proper, but remember, these countries had massive empires that went around the world, and they used lots of slaves there in the sugar-producing islands, in the Caribbean, in parts of Africa, in parts of the Orient. And Lincoln wanted to say, look, you guys have had this argument and you came out and said, no, we're going to end slavery in our empires. Well, now, if you're going to go in on the side of the Republicans, or excuse me, the side of the Confederates in order to get their cotton, then you're going to have to tell the world, yep, we're back to backing slavery. And the last thing is, it informed the African Americans that they'd have no fear that they'd be returned to slavery if the North won. Now, that way, as the Northern armies moved into the South, they would be greeted, helped by the Southern slaves, because once the Northerners had arrived, the African Americans would feel that they had now been liberated, and they'd want to help those people. Not everyone, however, agreed with the Emancipation Proclamation. It had a negative effect in part of the army and in part of the country. Let's think about this. I'm going to use a different kind of an example. September 11th, 2001, the World Trade Center was blown up. We had 9/11, other attacks were made. The United States was attacked on its home soil. Now, let's suppose that you have a patriotic American person who happens to be a Muslim. And they say, no, I don't like this terrorist business. I don't go along with that at all. I love my country, and I'm going to join the military to fight for my country, to keep terrorism away from my people and my home. And so this person joins up, and they fight on for a couple of years. They go to a war zone and they help with this war against terrorism. And then let's suppose that somebody declares, no, this is actually a war now to eliminate Islam. We want to get rid of Islam. Well, that person said, wait a minute, that's not what I signed on for. Islam is my religion and I love it. I have no interest in fighting against it. You told me that I would be fighting, and the reason I signed on was in order to fight for my country and to end terrorism. Well, the same idea is here in play in the Civil War. Some of those soldiers had said, I love my country and I want to fight to preserve it, to keep the whole country together, the entire United States. And now along comes Abraham Lincoln with this Emancipation Proclamation. And he says, no, 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 we are fighting to preserve the Union, but we are also fighting to free the slaves. Do you remember what we talked about a little bit earlier with those immigrants? People who came off the boats from other countries who perhaps didn't have English language skills. And so they took the lowest of jobs, rag picking, cleaning out stables, doing nasty, nasty work. Many of them, because jobs were available, had joined the armies. Actually, there were some in the Confederate Army and a large, large number in the Union Army. Because more immigrants moved to the north, there were more jobs available at lower levels. Well, now these people who had seen friends fight and die to preserve the Union, to keep the country together, a country they had recently moved to, now were being told that they were fighting to free the slaves. And remember our conversation. If those slaves were freed, then clearly hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of them would move north, away from the area where they had been kept as slaves, moved into an area they perceived as more free. Now, these people, these what would then be former slaves, would have very little education. So they also would lack the language skills, and they would have to do the lowest level of jobs like rag picking or cleaning out stables, exactly the jobs that some of the immigrants hoped to go home to. That job competition would mean that those jobs would pay less, or that those jobs might not be available because while an immigrant might be off fighting in the army and a freed slave came and took his position, when he returned, the position is filled. So it was not welcomed with open arms by certain people. And again, please, please, please take off your blinders. Don't think that because somebody here doesn't want job competition, that they immediately hate Black people and really, really love slavery. That's not it. What they did was they loved their families and they wanted the ability to provide for them. And they saw the freeing of the slaves as a threat to their livelihood after the war. So the Emancipation Proclamation, a very important document. But what did it actually do? On January 1st, 1863, it went into effect. And Lincoln said all slaves held in areas outside of his control, the areas that were still in rebellion, were free. However, those areas were out of his control, and the Southerners certainly were not going to free their slaves because Lincoln said they should. Remember the Southern point of view. From the Southern point of view, the Confederate States of America was a separate nation. They were fighting for their independence as a separate nation. So Abraham Lincoln declaring that their slaves were free had no more hold over them than if today the president of France declared that every teenager in the United States should shave his or her head. You'd say, what do I care what the president of France thinks? He's not my president. He's the president over the French. Well, the Southerners said, hey, wait, what do we care what Abraham Lincoln says? He's not our president. He's not even a citizen of our country. He belongs over in the United States. We are the Confederate States. Of course, if you now take it from the Northern point of view, Abraham Lincoln was the president of all of the United States, including those states which were in rebellion. There's the difference. The way the Northerners saw it, those Southern states had not and could not leave the United States. Therefore, Lincoln's order, the Emancipation Proclamation, held sway over their territory and did, in fact, free their slaves. So, as a practical matter, which slaves were freed on January 1st, 1863? The answer would be zero on that day. How many would be freed later? Millions. There would be other laws that we'll talk about when we finish the Civil War that really made sure that the slaves would stay free, that this Emancipation Proclamation could not be taken back. All right, tiny people, do not forget, we have a quiz coming up next Tuesday. Monday, we're going to be off. There's going to be no school. And so Tuesday, that's when you're going to come back and you will have your fantastic quiz number 3. Remember, this time it will be, Jefferson. Jefferson is going to be writing the essays. And the other 3 will be taking the online quiz. I've looked at some of the grades now, and I'm going to ask you to do something. As you go through the quizzes, please don't be in a hurry. They don't take very long. Maybe I'll have 40 questions, I think is about what I've had before. And that might take you, 10, 15 minutes to go through if you know your material fairly well. But there are a number of people who have made really, really fundamental mistakes. And I don't think they would have had they just taken time with each question. Remember, don't glance at the question. Think back on that test early in the year where I started off and said, Jesus, and then all kinds of you put down the year 0. And I said, Jesus was born hundreds of years before this happened, or before William the Conqueror led his Norman army against the Saxons and started the modern country of England. And then the next question said, William the Conqueror was born hundreds of years after this happened because this is the year Jesus was born. And people who just glanced at the first word and jumped in and wrote their answer didn't have a chance to digest it and say, wait, I know what year Jesus was born because I wrote the right one down only when I saw the word Jesus. And I saw William the Conqueror. I wrote the correct year down. It just wasn't the correct question because I didn't take time to carefully read. So please do that. All right, tiny people. Love and I miss y'all. Hasta la vista, babies.